while the least dramatic look at this year's Met Gala might have been the most on theme, and it reveals fashion's own bias. In fact, it reminded me of how some Western scholars viewed Chinese fashion at the beginning of last century. A lot of people criticized how Chanel dressed Bhavitha for the Met. It was too plain, too simple, underwhelmingly appropriate for the event. But one fashion commentator argued that this is exactly why it worked. Because the artistry wasn't just in the dramatic silhouette. It was the textile illusion, the craftsmanship, the construction, the material manipulation, the accumulated labor and technical skills hidden behind the deceptively simple look. And that's when Chinese textiles came to mind. I'm sure that applies to a lot of ethnic traditional garments as well. At one point, some Western scholars argued that China had no fashion, and this sentiment was echoed by Chinese intellectuals themselves, like Eileen Chang. To them, Chinese clothing didn't change enough for the last hundreds or even thousands of years. But what many of them were looking for was the changing silhouette, shape, outline, cut, volume. And of course, silhouette change definitely happens in Chinese garment throughout history. It's just not the primary place where fashion innovation and consumption happens. In many Chinese dress traditions, the change was also embedded in textiles. In weaving, in dyeing technology, in placement of symbolic motifs, the evolution of motifs, the color symbolism, the embroidery, the surface treatment, and even the refinement of the material itself. So if we're only looking at silhouette, we're missing a lot of other things. And I think this is why people find Chanel disappointing, because they were expecting a visual spectacle, but technically the illusion work was extremely sophisticated. It looked like denim was actually silk construction and textile manipulation. I thought it was jeans too. And that distinction matters because not all fashion systems communicate sophistication through visual loudness. Some communicate it through material intelligence, through restraint, surface, and accumulated craftsmanship. And historically, this is true for a lot of Asian textile traditions. Damas, pattern gauze, curses, tapestry weave are more subtle, and you also have brocades, a bit more dramatic, and they have complex loom structures, embroidery traditions and innovations, and expansion of dyes and colors, resist dyeing, clamp resist, wax resist dyeing, motif symbolism, placement, evolution. These were major achievements in artistry and technical mastery, even when the silhouette themselves were relatively stable. One of the interesting stories related to this was in the early 1900s, about 1920s or 30s, guests were invited to attend a full-day social gathering, and it's common for guests to bring a set of clothes to change. And one person wore something that's identical from what the person wore earlier in the day, except the floral embroidery has subtly changed from flower bud to a full bloom, signifying the passage of time. It was a quiet way of identifying who in the room had the aesthetic literacy to spot it. So perhaps the issue was not that China never had fashion, but that some observers were only trained to recognize only one language of fashion change. And if you only define fashion through recognizable dramatic silhouette transformation, then the entire textile-based aesthetic system can start to appear invisible.